Thursday, May 6th. The situation in India continues to worsen. There are news reports out on the fact that it is hitting its peak right now, and we're going to see a turn. Yet there's plenty of opinion out there about the fact that what peak, where, who came up with that idea. And there's plenty of opinion, good, bad, and ugly, about the role of the Modi government. Now, India is a complicated place, and its politics are even more complicated. So I think it's important to perhaps step back and try and understand some of the issues. Easier said than done, of course. So I decided that for wonderful women doing wonderful work, I wanted to interview Dr. Anshu Chatterjee. She is a political science professor of comparative politics and security in South Asia. So, South Asia meaning not just India, but also other South Asian nations. And Anshu teaches at the Naval Security Affairs Department at the Naval Postgraduate School. I just want to read out, she's published on a variety of topics associated with developments in the region that include civil-military relations, electoral victory of the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, and of course various social movements. Her current research examines the development of protest and crowd responses in relation to identity, politics, and state-society relations in South Asia and comparative settings. So definitely very relevant to some of what we see going on, what we've seen going on in these last few years. But today I wanted to talk with her about the situation on ground right now to help try and distill the complexity of what people are thinking about the Modi government, to help us understand, us meaning Indians outside of India and frankly non-Indians too. So here is Dr. Anshu Chatterjee. I don't know if we've peaked yet, but is at this very, very critical point where the COVID situation is completely out of hand. Has this happened? Has it gotten to this state because of the laxity of the Modi government?
Well, simple answer is yes. So, as you know, India has a weak health system historically. It's a developing country. We don't have too many resources, right? So health system is a reflection of that. And can we blame all of that on the BJP? No. But the reality is the government needs to do the best it can given the resources it has, right? For example, United States, as you know, has spent trillions of dollars, actually. I think it's about 7 trillion now, have been committed to this. US is a much richer country, right? India does not have those kind of resources, but what we are looking here at is Modi administration has made some decisions in over last 1 year, which did not prepare for the worst, right? So I agree, it doesn't have too many resources. Some people will defend and say we don't have those kind of resources. Yes, India does not, but there are certain decisions that it made that actually added to the crisis.
What kind of decisions?
Yeah, so let's look at it, right? So overall, to summarize, it basically started to deal with COVID. Even though initially it created, in March last year, it implemented a severe lockdown, as you know, right? And that was a health policy, right? After that, what we see is that its COVID implementation becomes subservient to its economic and foreign policy rather than a health policy. Okay. So, and one can say, okay, you know, we need economic goes with health because people need to go to work. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. They do need to go to work.
Lockdown fatigue and how it's impacting business. Yes. And life.
Absolutely. So it's a little difficult to separate this from economic policy. But then it made certain promises and it did not follow through with them when it could have.
Like what?
So let me just talk about this, right? So for example, it's vaccination policy, which has become highly controversial policy right now, right? So its vaccination policy really didn't kick in till January this year. Okay, so while rest of the world, the developed world, the so-called rich world, was buying vaccinations, they were buying vaccines and investing in them starting in June. India did not. India, for the first time, ordered vaccines in January. By then, most of the rich world had bought up 60% of vaccines, even though India produces most of these vaccines.
So this is what I'm finding hard to understand. India is known to be the largest or one of the largest producers of vaccines. How
Absolutely.
then does our own vaccination policy not kick in till January? I'm finding it hard to reconcile these two things.
Yeah, so this has to do with the fact how the lockdown worked out, right? So to go back to the lockdown in March 2020, right? So the government implements a severe lockdown, even though 100 million people actually fled the cities, looking for jobs. Well, they didn't have jobs, so they had to leave. They went back to their villages where they could sit and basically feed themselves back to their families, right? So even though this was considered initially a dangerous thing, a miracle happened. The numbers were not that high. Okay. So because the numbers initially were not high, and the only explanation we have for that, and a lot of people have tried to explain this, is that the fact that India A has a youngish population, and the first mutation of this COVID was actually not that strong. So Indian young population is able to handle it, right? So a lot of people got sick, but they got over it. Okay. Number two, that India had been exposed to some version of COVID for a few years now, because COVID is not new, right? There are various COVID virals floating around for the last 7-8 years. So the other explanation is that India, to some extent, had already been exposed to it, so immunities were higher. So because India saw low numbers, the government decided that it could actually stop paying attention to the health policy, right? So it basically made all these promises. So the first time, so in March last year, it promised it offered about 300 million. It basically said we're putting in 300 million to address COVID, 300 million US dollars, okay? This is when US decided to spend 2.5 trillion, okay? And then in the summer, President Trump, who we all know was skeptical about COVID, put in another 2 trillion. And then in December, he put in another 2 trillion. And then when US was doing okay in January, Biden promised 4 trillion. So see the difference here?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So hospitals are not prepared for this. All right. So the second thing it did was it basically did not follow through with the promises it made, right? So people were told, the poor were told, stay home and we will pay for you. And the government, Modi administration, relied on private sector to do this. They told the private sector, we'll give you loans to do this. Businesses will get loans from banks, okay, in order to help you. Business COVID loans were promised. These COVID loans didn't come through because the banks were not given guarantees. So if you remember, India had a banking crisis last 3-4 years before
That's right.
COVID. Yeah. Right. So the banks were saying, we don't know if we can give these loans. We don't have the money to do it. So the banks were not giving loans to businesses who stopped paying people. So people then had to go to work. So you have a failed health policy. And then because the numbers initially remain low, the government decided it doesn't matter. It's okay, we're doing fine.
So that's it. That's exactly what I wanted to ask you. This slowdown in the health policy, was it justifiable because the numbers weren't rising? So that's what the government thought, and that's what a lot of people said. So what we have here is, because the numbers are low, the government decides that it's okay. We're going to tell people there are certain rules. You need to do this, you need to do that during COVID. Be cautious. And we have health advisors who are saying mutations can occur, right? So by December, we already knew that some mutations were occurring, but not even December. I mean, even in November, we knew some mutations were occurring, right? So you have health experts who are saying that we could see a mutation that could be very dangerous here, right? So we need to prepare for that. The government does not prepare because the numbers are fairly low. In November, we do start seeing a peak, but the government ignores that peak. And why does it ignore it? Because according to some health experts, they were not asking the health experts. They were asking bureaucrats and technocrats who were implementing economic and foreign policy.
So that's what I mean by it became part of the economic and foreign policy, right? People needed to go to work and numbers look relatively okay. So why prepare for a crazy mutation?
Okay, so
Yeah.
if there was this warning back
Yes.
then,
Yes.
my question then is, why does the government go forward with these super spreader events that we've heard about, election rallies, Kumbh Mela? Can you talk to me about those?
Yeah. So to go back to December point, right? So you have to follow, and so you have to follow the logic of the government here, or logic of the BJP administration, right? Because I'm saying BJP because this event, COVID did become politicized.
Okay.
Okay. So while the numbers are low, the government decides that it's going to take credit for this, right? Elections are coming up. Let's take credit for this, right? So let's keep on thinking that everything is fine, even though we do have some signs that things are not so fine, right? So January, it goes and buys it orders 100 million vaccines. Do you know what the Indian population is reading? Okay, so we need 20 million a day. We need 20 million people to be vaccinated a day in order to take care of this until July. The government ordered 100 million. Okay. And it went to a world forum and it basically told the world. So there was a world forum meeting. So this is where the foreign policy comes in, right? So Prime Minister goes to the world forum meeting and he basically says, India, we were expecting India not to do well. As everybody can see, India has done great. In fact, India can become a model for the rest of the world, right? Why? Because it integrated its COVID policy into its global policy, which is basically showing the world that India is going to be what's called now Vishwaguru, as you know, right? So
Guru,
BJP,
that the guru of the world.
guru of the world, basically, and if you remember, one of the reasons BJP got elected was because it promised its constituencies that India is going to become a global power, that it is a global power. It's just not going to be it's not being recognized as one. And that we need to go out there, India needs to go out there, promote itself, it needs to form alliances, and so on. This is BJP versus Congress foreign policy, right? So by January, it's basically out there promoting itself as a success story of COVID. And it starts distributing vaccines. 60 million vaccines were distributed by India to other developing countries. Why? To counter China's influence.
I see.
So while we're looking at Indian population by middle of March, only, 80 million Indians had been vaccinated. Out of that, only 10 million had received 2 doses. 60 million vaccines had actually left India.
So Anshu, this issue that you've raised of the BJP government trying to take credit for what they thought was
a success story.
A success story turned out, drastically to be the other way. I have been hearing a lot of assorted stories of threats, of supplies, oxygen concentrators and things coming through, being sent back to, I think there was a shipment from China because it was not routed through the government's office, the Prime Minister's office. Yes. Stories like that. Is this true? Is this happening?
Well, there are some stories on this, yes. So I think it is happening to some extent, but not completely, right? Now, the government has to ensure that things coming in work, right? It's part of government's job to make sure the medical equipment works. So you can't really blame the government for saying they need to go through the government. But again, remember, this is election time. This is all happening during election time, right? So one of the things the government, BJP administration has done, as I said, has politicized its COVID policy, right? It has taken control of resources. So in December, it declared, this act, Epidemic Something Act, which means the central government is in charge of distributing resources for the epidemic that is occurring, right? So why does it do that? Why did it do that in December? Because things were going well. It wanted to take credit for it. The central government is doing it. So the states are not going to be doing it, right? So now when resources are coming in, what you have is a government that is going to, again, try to use this to say that success story is connected to the central administration, not the states, right?
Is it even practical
Yeah.
that the central government could take control of this with the kind of country that India is? Would it even logistically, is it even practical?
So like I said, BJ, really in the beginning, right? So it's very difficult for India, given the fact that it doesn't have the resources a rich country has, right? So there is a capacity issue. Does the government have a capacity to do this, right? So I would say it's very difficult, and no, it cannot completely do it. But then it's also implementing policy or not implementing policy in a proper way either,
Right.
right? Like the vaccination policy, to go back to the vaccination policy, in January, the central government announced that it has the right to buy 50% of vaccines, the central government.
Right.
50% are going to be open up to the private sector and the states. Now, the state governments don't have the resources because the central government is controlling all the resources. And it also has to compete with the private sector and the world, who is now trying to buy vaccines from India.
So I would like to ask you about Adar Poonawalla, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Serum Institute of India. One of the biggest news stories that has hit the press and has sort of exploded virally in every single country, I think, is the fact that he declared that he had to leave for London because of threats demanding COVID-19 vaccinations. Can you explain what this means and how it ties into the politics?
Yeah, so Mr. Poonawalla has also said that he was getting threats from very important political people. So it's not only he was getting random threats, he was getting threats from very powerful people. So that's more important. That's a very important part of the story. I mean, he wasn't fleeing because an average person on the street was throwing rocks at him. He was fleeing because some very powerful people were threatening him.
So
right?
is this tied to the issue of the government trying to take credit?
So this is again it's a little more complicated than that, right? So Serum Institute of India was producing 2.5 million vaccines a day, right? But most of them were actually in the contractual obligations it had to other countries, right? So other rich countries had already bought some, right? And he was producing AstraZeneca, which is owned by Oxford. So they were also producing for other parts of the world, which Oxford was promising to, right? So most of the vaccines he was producing were not for India. Despite that, he managed to produce, and to give him full credit, 100 million for India, funded by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So BJP government, again, behind on this, right? So he's able to do all this. So now, of course, India has, so in February, India basically, so I think it's end of February, India ran out of vaccines. And it has not been able to deliver second doses to millions of people they gave vaccine to. So people are looking for someone to blame. Oh. And this poor guy is now running. And now the BJP government, meanwhile, has promoted and they allowed him to do this. They could have gone in and said, listen, you are in India, you need to produce for India first, and here are the resources to do it. Okay, because he needs resources. He needs to be able to buy supplies, right? They did not do this. Why? Because they are promoting the private sector as well.
Right.
Overall, BJP policy has been to stay out of the way of private sector.
I see.
Right?
So
let this private sector reign. Let it respond to the market. So the response of the market has been, we have a major crisis now, and there aren't enough supplies.
Yeah. So back to the BJP and something that you said a little bit earlier. You said this is election time, and there have been elections in various parts of the country: Tamil Nadu, Kerala, West Bengal, more than that. And actually, in these specific places, the BJP has lost. So can you explain that a little bit and what that means for the Modi government?
BJP was not expected to win in these states. In fact, it would have been a miracle had it won. Not a miracle, it would have been a shock because it has actually expanded itself in these states in the last decade without actually winning them.
This is what I don't understand. How does it lose? It was not expected to win, yet it has expanded its reach. How does that work?
Yeah, so it went from barely any presence a decade ago. It went from actually no presence in West Bengal, Kerala, and Tamil Nadu. Well, Tamil Nadu started to go in details. It did actually initially, it actually started asserting itself 15 years ago. But in Kerala and West Bengal, it had no presence. It won 38% of the votes in West Bengal, right? So it's actually for BJP, this is not a bad story. They were not expecting to win in West Bengal. It would have been a miracle if they had won, but they have managed to expand themselves tremendously, right? So these are the states. The bigger issue would be if actually lost in Uttar Pradesh and Hindi areas, the Hindi belt. And it has, the only place it had lost in the Hindi belt 2 years ago was Rajasthan, and which was a big surprise. So overall, to answer your question, this is not much of a loss for BJP.
It's not much of a loss. And of course, the situation 2 years ago in Rajasthan, today is a very different story. But is it a different story is my question. I looked at the approval ratings of Modi, and I looked at two different sources. One, there was an article in Fortune from May 3rd, which was a few days ago, and I'm just going to read this statement out. Yashwant Deshmukh, founder and editor of the Center for Voting Opinion in Election Research, which is a polling agency that surveys 3,000 people a week in 11 Indian languages, says that the number of respondents who describe themselves as very satisfied with Modi's performance has fallen sharply to 40%, down from 64% last year. So according to them, his approval ratings are dropping. When I looked at Morning Consult, which is this tracker that tracks a bunch of world leaders, he's still up there at about 65%. And in fact, he has the highest approval rating of all the world leaders.
Absolutely.
Tracked by Morning Consult, by taking the top spot, I think this week by a 12-point margin. So, I mean, what does this mean?
It was 80% a year ago before COVID. Indian voters are responding to a crisis. That is good news, right? So this notion that they vote for a party simply because it's a Hindu party is incorrect. We are looking at droppings in ratings. Now, it entirely depends on how the administration responds in the next few months, right? If he is able to turn it around, turn the crisis around, and he already is trying to do this, right? This Yogi Adityanath of BJP in Uttar Pradesh is going around threatening hospitals that you cannot complain of lack of oxygen because there's an attempt to control this narrative.
But that's not the way to address the crisis. You control the
narrative. That's not. So people are not stupid though, right? Because what he's trying to do is coming out in the media. It's coming out in the Indian media. It's not that BBC is doing it, because one of the things BJP is very good at is blaming the outsiders. So if external media says something, they'll say, oh, it's external media, right? They're out to get us. So the good news is that Indian media is leading these stories, right? So unless BJP is able to turn the situation around in the next couple of months, you're going to see further dropping in his ratings, right? And that's going to hurt him. Now, so overall, the macro picture, however, is that just when the Indian economy was about starting to recover, we have this.
How likely is it that he could turn things around in the next couple of months? Whether he can actually do good or with this forced controlled narrative, either way.
I think it's going to be difficult in next couple of months, right? So as you know, COVID has low fatality rate if you have the supplies to take care of it, right? So he has to somehow bring in the supplies in the next 1 month to deal with this crisis across India, because we've only seen what's happening in Mumbai and Delhi in the media. This is spreading across other cities. Allahabad has got severe shortages already. So as you know, Indian cities are huge. So he has to implement a major lockdown at this point. Okay.
And,
He has to bring in supplies.
and the news reports this week are talking about how it's increasingly spreading into the rural areas as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
Anshu, there is a petition that's going around. It's on
Yeah.
change.org, and it is calling for people to sign it to ask Modi to step down. Now, the last I looked, which was sometime this morning, it were, the number of signatures were up to about 8 lakhs or near 8 lakhs or 800,000, I should say. And at the point where it reaches 10 lakhs or 1 million signatures, it becomes one of the top signed petitions on change.org. My question is, does that even matter? Does it make a difference? That's not how you would bring Modi down from power, right?
No. I think, well, there is a parliamentary constitutional way of bringing him down, right? Which is called the no confidence motion, right? So in order for no confidence motion to go through when he's a majority party, is that some of his party members have to turn against him. Now, that is not impossible. It is doable because some people joined his party because other parties were failing. So that is possible. But in order for that to happen, a lot of constituents have to come out on the street. So 800,000 is nothing. That's a block in Delhi.
Mm.
Right? So what you need is millions and millions of people to sign this. You need millions of people to come out on the streets. I mean, the last time we had a majority government collapse was under Indira Gandhi, and a lot of people were on the streets.
Can you actually explain, using that analogy of Indira Gandhi?
Indira Gandhi didn't step down because of no confidence vote, right? She stepped down because millions of protesters showed up on the street, right? So she basically decided on her own that she's going to step down because millions of people showed up on the street. And that does happen, right? When there are millions of people protesting, the prime minister of a country does need to step down.
Right.
Right? It's the right thing. It's the right thing to do. The world leaders are going to push him if that becomes the case. You are then under. So one of the ways to control the protesters is to send out police, and usually turns into some kind of violence. Right? That is not acceptable. Right? But going back to the no confidence motion, as I said, he is head of a party that is a majority in the government right now. So the only way no confidence is going to work is within the constitutional framework, is that if you have his party members leaving him, right? In 2014 election, he was part of a coalition. So the coalition members can back out. This is not the case with 2019 government. He is actually fully in power. His party, BJP, is fully in power, right? So the only way no confidence is going to work if his own party leaders, if party MPs turn against him, right? But we do have, we do have people who protest and successfully step down because of protest historically. Yeah.
So, Anshu, what would you say is your outlook on this situation for the next foreseeable future, however you define that? And what is it important for people to know?
So as I said when we started this, I'm trying to be optimistic. Okay, optimistically, I think it's important that people stay healthy and go to work. Okay, and I think and as much as I think BJP is at fault, one of the things they need to do that is turn this around, right? And it does need the world help for this. And the world is, I think, willing to help. As we all know, India is too big to fail and too big to ignore. You can't have millions of people dying. The world is not going to allow that. They're going to give resources. They're going to send in the experts. The government just has to be able to implement this properly now. Okay, which is not going to go really well with, as you know, the Indian attitude in last decade, which has been that we do not last decade, Indian attitude for decades now, which is we don't want to rely on rest of the world. They're gonna have to bite the bullet and actually take help at this point. And I think they don't have a choice.
And that is Dr. Anshu Chatterjee, political scientist and professor of comparative politics and security in South Asia. Not only does she teach at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, but she is also a good friend. So thank you, Anshu. Thank you for helping us make sense of this situation, whatever that means for whoever's watching.